Imagine a world of absolute white. An endless, blinding expanse of ice stretches in every direction, meeting a pale, unforgiving sky. The silence is profound, broken only by the mournful groan of shifting ice floes and the sharp, cutting wind. This is a prison without walls, a cage made of cold. The sun hangs low on the horizon, a distant, powerless orb offering no warmth, only a cold, indifferent light. To be here is to feel utterly alone, a tiny, fragile speck in a vast, frozen desert. It is a place that does not care for human life, a landscape of raw, elemental power that can crush bone and spirit with equal ease. This was the world that swallowed the USS Jeannette and her crew, a world from which there seemed to be no escape. This landscape was a living, breathing monster. The ice was not static, it moved with the currents of the unseen ocean below. Massive plates of ice, some rising like jagged mountains, would collide with thunderous force, creating pressure ridges that snaked across the frozen sea for miles. Other times, dark leads of open water would appear, teasing with the promise of escape, only to freeze over again in a matter of hours. The men aboard the trapped ship felt like they were adrift not on water, but on a solid, yet unstable continent of ice. Their vessel, once a symbol of human ingenuity and strength, was now just a toy in the grip of this immense, indifferent force, its fate tied to the whims of the Arctic. The isolation was a weight on the soul. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light of the long polar night, or the eerie twilight of the Arctic sun. There was no news from the outside world, no letters from home, no sign of another living human soul beyond their own small, dwindling company. They were adrift at the top of the world, forgotten. The sheer scale of their predicament was difficult to comprehend. They had sailed north in search of glory and discovery, but now their world had shrunk to the confines of their wooden ship, a tiny island of warmth and life in a universe of cold and death. The psychological toll was immense, a slow-burning fear that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. This was the agonizing reality for the 33 men of the USS Jeannette. They were pioneers, explorers, and sailors, filled with the bold spirit of their age. But the Arctic did not recognize their courage or their ambition. It saw only a foreign object, an intrusion to be slowly, methodically squeezed and broken. The creaking timbers of their ship became the soundtrack to their lives, a constant reminder of the immense pressure building around them. Every snap of the wood, every shudder of the hull, was a whisper of their potential doom. They had entered a realm where nature, in its most extreme form, made all the rules, and they were merely waiting for its final, crushing judgment. Before she was a prisoner of the ice, the USS Jeannette was a vessel of great hope and national pride. Originally a British Royal Navy gunboat named the HMS Pandora, she was purchased in 1878 by James Gordon Bennett, Jr., the wealthy and eccentric publisher of the New York Herald. Bennett was a man who craved spectacle and grand adventure, and he saw the conquest of the North Pole as the ultimate story. He poured his immense fortune into refitting the ship, strengthening her hull with oak timbers and plating her bow with iron to withstand the rigors of the Arctic. Renamed the Jeannette in honor of his sister, the ship was a testament to the era's boundless optimism and its faith in technology to conquer any frontier. The crew selected for this daring voyage was a collection of brave and experienced men. At the helm was Lieutenant Commander George W. DeLong, a dedicated and respected naval officer with a burning ambition to reach the pole. DeLong was a meticulous planner and a determined leader, a man who believed deeply in the mission. His second-in-command was Lieutenant Charles W. Chipp, a loyal and steady officer. The ship's engineer George W. Melville was a brilliant and resourceful man whose skills would prove indispensable. The crew also included a scientist, a naturalist, and a host of hardy sailors, all drawn by the promise of adventure and the glory of planting the American flag at the top of the world. They were the best of the best, ready to face the unknown. On July 8, 1879, the USS Jeannette departed from San Francisco to a grand farewell. Crowds cheered from the docks, flags waved, and steam whistles blew in salute. The air was thick with excitement and patriotism. The expedition was not just a private venture, it had the official sanction of the U.S. Navy. The men were full of confidence, their spirits high. They were armed with the latest scientific instruments, 3 years' worth of provisions, and an unshakable belief in their success. They were not just sailing into the Arctic, they were sailing into history. The journey ahead was imagined as a difficult but ultimately triumphant passage through the ice to a warm, open sea that was believed to lie at the pole. Their hopes were buoyed by the prevailing theories of the day. They carried charts and maps from respected geographers who argued that a warm current flowed north from Japan, creating an ice-free passage to the pole. The mission was seen as a logical, scientific endeavor. As they sailed north through the Bering Strait, their optimism remained intact. They were adventurers on the cusp of a great discovery, pioneers about to fill in the last blank spot on the map. They could not have known that the theories they relied on were fatally flawed. They were sailing not toward an open sea, but directly into the jaws of the most formidable ice pack on the planet, their vessel of ambition soon to become a tomb of ice. The initial weeks of the voyage were filled with promise. After passing through the Bering Strait in late August 1879, the Jeannette pushed into the Chukchi Sea. The weather was manageable, and the crew was in high spirits, eagerly anticipating their breakthrough into the fabled open polar sea. DeLong navigated carefully, pushing ever northward, searching for the warm current that was supposed to guide them. They encountered scattered ice, but the ship's reinforced hull handled it with ease. The men felt confident, powerful. Their modern vessel, they believed, was more than a match for the frozen obstacles in their path. The mood aboard the ship was one of eager expectation, the final prize seemingly within their grasp. The change came suddenly and without mercy. On September 6, 1879, near Herald Island, the sea began to thicken. The scattered floes consolidated into a vast, unbroken sheet of ice. At first, DeLong was not overly concerned. He had expected to encounter an ice barrier and believed he could push through it. He ordered the engines to full power, and the Jeannette charged at the ice. The ship shuddered, her iron-plated bow biting into the frozen mass, but the ice held firm. They tried again and again, but it was no use. The pack was too thick, too vast. Within hours, the new winter ice began to form around them, cementing their position. The Jeannette was stuck fast, held in a grip that would never let go. In the early days of their entrapment, a sense of determined optimism prevailed. The crew believed this was a temporary setback. Surely the ice would break up with a change in the winds or the currents. Engineer Melville kept the engines ready, hoping for a sudden chance to break free. DeLong maintained strict naval discipline, keeping the men busy with daily routines and scientific observations. They charted their position, measured the temperature, and studied the aurora borealis that danced in the sky above them. They were explorers, after all, and even in this predicament, there was work to be done. They were simply waiting for their opportunity, confident that it would come. But as weeks turned into months, that early confidence began to erode. The ship was not stationary. It was being carried along with the drifting ice pack, but not toward the pole. Instead, the Jeannette began a long, slow, aimless drift to the northwest, moving at the mercy of forces beyond anyone's control. The men watched their hopes of reaching the pole vanish as they were dragged farther away from their goal. The temporary setback was starting to look like a permanent condition. The ship, once their vehicle of discovery, had become their floating prison. They were no longer masters of their own destiny, but passengers on a frozen, meandering river of ice with no known destination. As the long Arctic winter descended, bringing with it perpetual darkness and crushing cold, life aboard the Jeannette settled into a monotonous and challenging routine. DeLong knew that idleness would be their enemy, so he kept his men on a strict schedule. Days were organized around work details, mealtimes, and mandatory exercise. The crew had to constantly maintain the ship, chipping away the ice that threatened to encase it and keeping the machinery in working order. They hunted the occasional polar bear or seal that wandered near the ship, a welcome addition to their dwindling rations and a brief, violent distraction from the endless waiting. This routine was a shield against the creeping despair that the darkness and isolation brought. The cold was a constant physical enemy. Temperatures plummeted to 40, 50, and even 60 degrees below zero. Inside the ship, condensation froze on the walls, covering everything in a layer of frost. The men bundled themselves in layers of wool and fur, but the cold seeped into their bones. Frostbite was a persistent danger, and the simple act of touching a piece of metal with a bare hand could instantly tear away skin. The ship, which had once felt so sturdy, now seemed fragile against the immense cold. The men huddled around the ship's stoves, their only source of warmth, listening to the wind howl outside and the ice groan and crack around their hull. a constant, terrifying reminder of their precarious situation. Fear began to take root in the hearts of the crew. The initial optimism had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim uncertainty. The ship was taking a terrible beating from the shifting ice. Pressure ridges would form nearby, and the immense forces would cause the Jeannette's timbers to shriek and groan in protest. The men would lie in their bunks at night, listening to the sounds of their ship being slowly squeezed, wondering if this would be the night the hull finally gave way. The psychological strain was immense. They were thousands of miles from civilization, trapped in a hostile environment with their fate entirely out of their hands. The darkness was not just outside, it was seeping into their minds. Despite the fear, moments of humanity and hope flickered. They celebrated holidays like Christmas with what little cheer they could muster, singing songs and sharing extra rations. The ship's naturalist, Raymond Newcomb, documented the Arctic wildlife, and the scientist, Jerome Collins, conducted meteorological experiments, trying to find meaning and purpose in their situation. They held amateur theatrical performances to lift their spirits and read from the ship's library. These small acts of normalcy were a desperate attempt to hold on to their civilization, to remind themselves that they were more than just survivors. They were men of science and culture, clinging to their identity in a world that sought to erase it. The entire premise of the Jeannette expedition was built upon a captivating and ultimately fatal geographical theory, the idea of an open polar sea. For centuries, cartographers and explorers had speculated about what lay at the very top of the world. In the 19th century, a prominent theory championed by geographers like August Petermann of Germany suggested that a warm current, an extension of the Kuroshio current from Japan, flowed northward through the Bering Strait. This current, it was believed, created a temperate, ice-free sea surrounding the North Pole. It was a tantalizing idea, a navigable waterway to the pole, and perhaps even to new, undiscovered lands teeming with life. This theory was not just a wild fantasy, it was supported by seemingly logical observations. Whalers reported seeing warmer waters and northward drifting currents. Migrating birds were seen flying north into the Arctic vastness, presumably toward unknown nesting grounds. Logs and other debris from Siberian rivers were found on the shores of Greenland, suggesting a current flowed across the polar basin. For men like DeLong and his patron Bennett, this was compelling evidence. They imagined sailing through a barrier of ice into a calm, open ocean, a mariner's paradise at the top of the world. The Jeannette was specifically routed to find this warm current and ride it to glory. As the Jeannette remained trapped and drifted helplessly northwestward, the crew clung to this myth. Their own observations seemed to mock the theory. All they saw was ice, endless and solid. Yet hope died hard. Perhaps they were just on the wrong side of the current. Perhaps, just beyond the next pressure ridge, lay the open water they so desperately sought. They would climb to the crow's nest and scan the horizon for a water sky, the dark reflection of open water on the clouds. But they saw only an ice blink, the white glare indicating more ice ahead. The open polar sea became a kind of phantom, a dream that sustained them even as the reality around them grew ever more grim. The slow, agonizing drift of the Jeannette provided the final, fatal refutation of the theory. Instead of finding a warm current flowing north, they were caught in a massive circular gyre of ice that moved slowly westward. The land they eventually sighted, which they named Jeannette Island and Henrietta Island, was not part of a temperate continent but barren, ice-covered rocks. Their journey proved that the Arctic Ocean was not an open sea, but a formidable ice-choked basin. They were the unwilling test subjects in an experiment that disproved a centuries-old myth. The price of this new knowledge would be their ship and many of their lives. The dream of an open polar sea had led them directly into a frozen hell. After 21 months adrift, the end for the USS Jeannette came with shocking violence. By early June of 1881, the pressure from the surrounding ice pack had become relentless. The ship had withstood incredible forces for nearly 2 years, a testament to its strong construction, but its time was running out. The groans of its timbers had become a constant, agonizing symphony of destruction. The men knew the hull could not take much more. They lived in a state of high alert, their survival gear packed and ready. They had already begun moving provisions and their small boats onto the ice, preparing for the inevitable. The ship was dying, and they were witnesses to its slow, painful execution. The final moments occurred on the evening of June 12, 1881. The ice, which had briefly relaxed its grip, suddenly closed in with terrifying force. A massive floe struck the Jeannette on its starboard side. The men below deck heard a sound like a cannon shot as massive oak beams snapped. Water began pouring into the engine room. Engineer Melville and his team worked frantically with the pumps, but it was a hopeless battle. The ice had ripped a fatal wound in the ship's side. DeLong gave the order he had dreaded for months: abandon ship. There was no panic, only a grim orderly exodus as the men moved the last of their supplies and themselves onto the unstable ice. From the relative safety of the ice, the 33 men watched their home and prison sink. The Jeannette listed heavily, its masts tilting toward the frozen surface. The pressure of the ice continued to mount, squeezing the hull until its structure completely failed. With a final shuddering groan, the ship broke apart. The stern rose high into the air, and then, at around 4 a.m. on June 13th, the USS Jeannette slipped beneath the ice and vanished into the dark, frigid water. All that remained was a churning patch of debris and the silent, stunned crew, standing alone on a moving ice floe hundreds of miles from the nearest land, their last link to civilization, gone. Forever. The sinking of the ship marked the beginning of a new and even more terrifying chapter in their ordeal. They were now truly castaways, stranded in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Their only hope for survival was to walk south, dragging their heavy boats and meager supplies across a treacherous, ever-shifting landscape of ice and open water leads. DeLong gathered his men, took a navigational reading, and pointed toward the distant coast of Siberia. They were over 500 miles away from land. The long march had begun. They were no longer sailors. They were a desperate band of survivors, about to undertake one of the most grueling journeys in the history of exploration. The journey across the ice was a descent into hell. The 33 survivors had to haul 3 small boats, 2 cutters and a whaleboat, along with sledges laden with provisions, across a landscape that was actively working against them. The surface was not flat. It was a chaotic jumble of sharp ice, deep snowdrifts, and towering pressure ridges that had to be painstakingly climbed over. Worse still, they soon discovered a horrifying truth. While they marched south for miles each day, the ice floe they were on was drifting north, canceling out their progress. For weeks they were locked in a Sisyphean struggle, exhausting themselves only to end up farther from their destination. Hunger and cold were their constant companions. Their rations were severely limited, and the physical exertion of hauling the heavy sledges burned through calories at an alarming rate. The men grew weaker by the day, their bodies wasting away. Their clothing, constantly wet from sweat and melting snow, offered little protection against the biting wind. Frostbite was rampant, turning fingers and toes black. Snow blindness afflicted many, its searing pain adding to their misery. The sun, which now circled the sky without setting, became a torment, its relentless glare reflecting off the ice. Every step was an act of will, a battle against exhaustion, pain, and a growing sense of utter hopelessness. The mental toll was as severe as the physical one. DeLong struggled to maintain discipline and morale. He pushed the men relentlessly, knowing that to stop was to die. Yet despair was a poison spreading through the group. They were adrift in an alien world, and the vast, empty landscape seemed to mock their efforts. The men became gaunt figures, their faces blackened by frost and sun, their eyes hollow. They moved like automatons, driven forward by the most basic instinct for survival. The camaraderie that had bound them on the ship began to fray under the immense strain, replaced by a grim, individual focus on enduring one more hour, one more day. After more than 2 months of this agonizing march, they finally reached the edge of the ice pack and open water. Their joy was short-lived. A fierce gale descended as they launched their 3 small boats, separating them in the violent, icy seas. One boat, captained by Lieutenant Chip, vanished with its 8 men, never to be seen again. The other 2 boats, one commanded by DeLong and the other by Engineer Melville, were left to face the storm alone. The brutal march across the ice was over, but their ordeal had simply entered a new, equally perilous phase. They had traded the solid prison of the ice for the raging fury of the Arctic Ocean. The 2 remaining boats fought their way through the storm toward the Siberian coast. Melville's whaleboat, containing 10 other men, was the luckier of the 2, Battered but intact, they made landfall at one of the eastern mouths of the Lena River Delta. They were exhausted, starving, and frost-bitten, but they were alive. They soon encountered friendly local Tungus hunters who provided them with food and shelter. For Melville and his party, the long nightmare was nearing its end. Their survival was a testament to Melville's robust health, his iron will, and a great deal of luck. His first priority, after ensuring the safety of his men, was to find DeLong and the others. DeLong's boat, carrying 13 other men, was not so fortunate. They landed in a more remote, desolate part of the vast Lena Delta, a swampy, frozen labyrinth of mudflats and shallow streams with no sign of human life. They were in even worse shape than Melville's group, their strength utterly depleted by the journey. Their bitter salvation on land was just the beginning of a final, desperate struggle. With their last provisions gone, they were starving. DeLong sent 2 of the strongest men, Nindemann and Noros, ahead to seek help, while he and the remaining 11 men, too weak to travel, waited for rescue. The final days for DeLong and his party are chronicled in his journal, which he faithfully kept until his hand could no longer hold a pencil. The entries are a heartbreaking record of starvation, freezing temperatures, and fading hope. One by one, the men succumbed. DeLong's entries grow shorter, his handwriting weaker, as he records the deaths of his companions. They died not with drama, but with a quiet, freezing exhaustion. Their struggle was no longer against the grand, violent forces of the ice, but against the slow, creeping emptiness in their own stomachs and the cold seeping into their core. It was a lonely, agonizing end at the very edge of the world. Nindemann and Noros, after an incredible feat of endurance, eventually found a small native settlement, and were saved. They were able to guide Melville to the area where they had left DeLong. In the spring of 1882, Melville's search party found the final camp. They discovered the frozen bodies of DeLong and his last 2 companions, lying in the snow where they had fallen. Nearby they found DeLong's journal and the ship's logs, the precious records of their epic and tragic journey. Of the 33 men who had sailed from San Francisco with such high hopes, only 13 had survived. The vast, silent delta had become the final resting place for the captain and the men who had followed him to the end. The legacy of the USS Jeannette is etched in ice and tragedy. The expedition was a catastrophic failure in its stated goal of reaching the North Pole. It cost the lives of 20 men, including its valiant commander, and ended with the destruction of their ship. The story is a haunting reminder of the brutal power of nature and the hubris of an age that believed it could conquer any frontier. The Arctic did not yield to their ambition, it swallowed them whole. The memory of DeLong and his men, dying of starvation in the frozen mud of the Lena Delta, serves as a grim counterpoint to the romantic tales of polar exploration. It is a story of suffering, endurance, and ultimate defeat. Yet, from the disaster came invaluable knowledge. The Jeannette's long 2-year drift proved definitively that the open polar sea was a myth. The meteorological and oceanographic data meticulously collected by DeLong and his crew, and heroically saved by Melville, provided the first real understanding of the Arctic ice pack's behavior. 3 years after the Jeannette sank, debris from the wreck, including clothing and equipment, washed up on the shores of Greenland. This discovery proved the existence of a transarctic drift, a current flowing from Siberia across the pole to the Atlantic. This insight would directly inspire future expeditions, most notably Fridtjof Nansen's successful drift on the ship. The story of the Jeannette is ultimately a human one. It is the story of George DeLong's unwavering dedication, even in the face of certain death, as he chronicled his crew's final days. It is the story of George Melville's incredible toughness and loyalty, as he survived his own ordeal and then braved another Arctic winter to find his lost comrades. It is the story of 33 men who faced the absolute worst the world could throw at them, who endured freezing, starvation, and despair, and who for the most part maintained their dignity and discipline to the very end. Their individual courage shines through the darkness of the overall tragedy, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Today, on this date of October 19, 2025, we look back at the agonizing story of the Jeannette. The Arctic remains a vast, mysterious, and unforgiving place, though its ice is now shrinking at an alarming rate due to a changing climate. The fate of the Jeannette is a powerful, timeless lesson. It speaks of the fine line between bravery and folly, between discovery and disaster. The echoes of the crushed ship and the ghosts of its lost crew still haunt the polar ice. They remind us of the profound and often terrible price of knowledge and the enduring, humbling power of the natural world, a world that will always have the final say.